Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. Delighted today to be joined by Chris McCulloch, who's CEO at RotaGeek. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for inviting me along.
No, you're more than welcome. I think you've got a really interesting story before we get into the detail of RotaGeek and some of the things we're going to talk about today, because before RotaGeek, you were an A&E doctor. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Go on, tell us about the transition then. I kind of see some links, but tell us about how you went from training to be a doctor, being a doctor, to then setting up RotaGeek.
Yeah, so I guess if you look at it to where I am now and where I started, it feels like a big jump. In reality, as in most of these sort of big jumps in life, it was just a series of sensible small steps. So yeah, started life as a doctor, and that's really all I wanted to do. You know, was never one of these docs who had a sort of ambition to leave the NHS and run a business, and loved it. And sort of long story short, trained up in Edinburgh. Went through sort of different levels of medical training, and ended up in emergency medicine at A&E, and totally loved it. It really plays to my personality of having a short attention span. I really like the unpredictability of A&E. I love the fact that you make a difference to lots of people very quickly, and then you go home. That was my career path. But sort of along that, I transitioned from being a career medic. When I left medical school, I wanted to be a professor in 10 years. I wanted to be a professor by the time I was 30. And then actually sort of looking at the NHS, which is a globally really efficient organization, if you look at it sort of at a high level. But when you're in it, you think, gosh, we can make this thing better. And I sort of developed a habit for trying to improve things and just sort of little things along the way, and really enjoyed that. And one of those was scheduling. And, you know, it was a challenge when I graduated back in 98. That dates me. It was a challenge then, and it's a challenge now. And it's how we started RotaGeek. You know, there was medics were going through and doctors were going through a particular transition in 2004, 5 was around the time that the European Working Time Directive was being brought in for doctors. So sort of additional hours regulations. And if you just looked at that, you know, it was clearly going to impact the way that doctors worked. It was going to create an impact on scheduling, and it was an opportunity just to do scheduling better. My now 2 RotaGeek co-founders, so 3 of us in total, got together and thought, we can do this much better. And we sort of devised this way of scheduling medical rotas, which is sort of academically really smart, and it would have made a really big difference to doctors' lives. So we approached the Department of Health, who had sort of pilot funding at the time for Working Time Directive pilots, and said, we've got this great idea, do you want to fund it? And they said no. So we started a company, and we only really started a company as a way to fund exploring this idea. And so we wasted our own time and money learning how not to run a business. And that was it. So that was sort of how we got the scheduling bug. And I'd been involved in scheduling previously, and my other co-founder, Roy Pounder, was a scheduling expert for the Royal College of Physicians. So, and Nick, who is now our CTO. So, you know, we had all the skills, and we then started to try and look at how you actually solve that in practice. And so there was this sort of interesting phase from, actually it was 2009 to 2014 was the sort of phase where we were running this as a project, wasting our own time and money, but learning loads of stuff about, you know, how you solve complex scheduling problems for big organizations. And then we commercialized it in 2014. So that's the sort of backstory. When you sort of look back on it, it looks like a big jump, but actually it was just a series of sensible steps that sort of led us to where we are now.
Amazing. Now, I love those good backstories with some real meat and bones around them. Most people fall into stuff, but yeah, I can see how that kind of transition works across. So 2014, you say RotaGeek was kind of really formalized into a business entity, is that right?
Yeah.
So what's the journey like been since then? So 6 years old this year?
Yeah.
I know we do quite a bit of stuff together, but for the listeners, it'd be good to give a quick overview of some of the bits that you guys do.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, in fact, we met just early on our commercialization journey. So we must have met in, 2014, 15, I think.
Yeah.
So where we are currently is we data optimize staff schedules for big enterprise organizations. So what that means in practice is we make scheduling kind of personalized for the business, but also for the employees. So we take a labor model. So for the organization, that means how many people do I need on at any one time? And of those people and team members, what skill mix do I need? What seniority do I need to meet my expected customer demand. But then we also take the preferences of the staff. So we take obviously their contracted hours, their skill mix, limits of the working time directive or specific work regulations, but also their work preference. So, they might be contracted to work 7 days a week, but they'd much rather work Sunday, not Thursday, for all sorts of reasons. And we take all of those constraints, and then we've developed with our data science team algorithms and then search the solution space to find an optimal solution to that puzzle, which in practice means that the business gets the people that it needs in the right place at the right time, lots of business benefits of that, and the employees get much more work-life balance and flexibility and tons of benefits to that. So that's the thing that we do differently, and that's sort of what we do now. And that's been as you say, like a 5-6 year journey of delivering for enterprise organizations. So when we first commercialized in 2014, it was through the Telefonica Business Accelerator WERA, which was transformative for us, and I guess sort of increased our ambitions to think that we would schedule for small to medium-sized organizations, a chain of coffee shops, for example, to actually we can solve this and deliver a big business benefit for large enterprise organizations. And the first of which was the O2 retail stores. And very early on, we delivered a big financial benefit in terms of, much more optimized scheduling. So we were able to, more effectively spend their payroll, if you like. And that was the point for us where we realized, gosh, we can make a big impact to big businesses, but also therefore to, many thousands of employees in the UK by allowing them to manage their work-life balance better.
Good stuff. So talking of big impacts, there's been a pretty seismic one across the world this year with COVID. And there's now lots of talk of certainly the UK as a productivity challenge based on some of the stats that you see released from the government. If we just think about UK retail, how do you see that kind of balance of productivity and well-being in a world where hopefully we're emerging from the pandemic, not going back into another one?
Yeah, so gosh, lots in that question. I think probably just at the start, and not to put a downer on it, we may be emerging, but it's not that clear. So with COVID particularly, there's been this acute shock where the world has changed fundamentally. And I think if you look at what's remarkable is you look across the population, across organizations, whether they're retailers or the NHS, the speed at which people and organizations have adapted is immense. And, it's only 6 months ago that, we were in a relatively normal world. So there's that sort of acute shock and then a sort of normalization to that new base. But, I think for all sorts of reasons, there's likely to be a recurrence. And I think that's probably what we're heading into Q4. While the government would like to believe that there are local recurrences, it's probably a national picture. So for retailers, I guess what that means is they've adapted to that acute shock, and most have done that, remarkably well. But then on top of that, you now have to cope with future uncertainty. So that sort of frames the world in which retailers are currently in. And then let's not forget, before COVID, retail was often in the headlines for having a really tough time. It's a really tough business to be in. And so, on the top of things like, changing consumer habits and Brexit and, the challenges of rental in the high street and the national living wage, pale into significance with COVID, but they're all still there. These problems are still there. And now we're starting to see those come back into the news, particularly with Brexit. So there's this really interesting sort of macroeconomic environment in which retailers were challenged anyway, and then have COVID on top of that. I think that the challenge for retailers is, if you sort of think about the challenges retailers were facing pre-COVID, they're kind of similar. It's just much more acute and much more accelerated. So I think retailers will need to redefine or look at their stores and understand what their stores do and how they best deliver. So, this shift, consumer behavior, so that move to online means there therefore needs to be more of a reason to go into bricks and mortar stores. And, there was a drive to experiential retail pre-COVID. I think that's much more acute now. And I think that's where retailers will be looking, what makes our stores a destination. And now that might be, an experiential destination, or it might be functional. So this move to, omnichannel and looking at in bricks and mortar store delivery of online purchases, pretty reasonable way to look at the world in the current situation. And that then sort of plays into, I guess we might touch on this in more detail, like how do you train your staff to deliver that? There might be some sort of training, cross-training, upskilling of staff. And then there are some obviously really sort of interesting digital ways of hyper-personalizing that in-store experience for customers. So I think that's one of the challenges that retailers are facing into now. They were probably thinking about these things anyway, and COVID has accelerated it. The stuff that I find interesting is the store operations bit, given where I've landed as an occupation. The challenge is, if you sort of think about your experience in, a supermarket recently, the challenges for those organizations is huge. So the complexity of having to deliver, I guess, with huge spikes in demand and then trying to forecast out what that demand is likely to be in the future. I think looking at their cost structure, so looking at broader retail, that move to online is often associated with a decreased margin. So therefore that hits profitability. How a store operation is going to be streamlined and sort of made more efficient to cope with that. One of the key things I think for retailers is to look at how you digitize or automate, I guess, non-value add tasks and minimize those where possible. Because, if we're thinking about retailer productivity, it's clearly a sort of interplay between how much you spend on delivering your retail organization and how much profit you make. And therefore, looking at how you deliver that in a much more efficient way is key. And so scheduling obviously is one of those processes that you can digitize and automate. I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit more. In doing that, you also clearly need to consider your staff and your workforce, and the impact on retail staff of COVID has been immense. The proportion of the entire, retail employee population in the UK who have been furloughed, the sort of the financial and psychological stress of that. And then, then you've got another proportion of retail staff in food and grocery retail that have been key workers and, keeping the nation fed, and the emotional turmoil of that, again, must be immense. So, I think retailers will be looking at how they need to look after their workforce, retain key talent. How do they keep them updated in a world where updated and trained in a world where we're not all going to sit in the same room for training? How do they sort of maximize skill mix and therefore sort of resilience in the workforce? Looking at, what happens if people are their teams will have incidents of needing to isolate or catching COVID and therefore, needing to be off work for a period that's difficult to plan for. Like, how do you increase that resilience? And so I think employers will be looking at how they sort of retain flexibility in their workforce and retain their workforce. And I think equally, employees will be looking to their employers to say, how can you support me in being more flexible? Today is the first day back at school for lots of children in the UK, and that presents challenges for working parents, and not only the sort of the regular challenges of school drop-offs and after-school clubs, but these schools they're cohorted. I was listening to the radio yesterday, and one school's got a cohort of 2,000 students, which clearly, if one of those students gets sick, you can't isolate that entire cohort. So it becomes a really interesting challenge for employers and employees to be much more, I guess, collaborative and cooperative in the face of this huge challenge and the uncertainty in the future. So I think that's not an extensive list, but there's just a list of challenges. But actually, some of these, they're hard, and it's really hard on the background of retailers being in a really challenging position pre-COVID. But actually, it's in some ways that it's driving some really exciting developments. Stores are just embracing digital transformation, and from our experience, they seem to be doing that in a really sensible way. And I guess it's COVID seems to have, at a sort of like operational level, accelerated a lot of the decisions that have really been on the agenda for a while. There's a move to retail that's been accelerated with COVID. How do you look after? How do you increase flexibility for your staff? And that's been accelerated. And how do you sort of engage with employee well-being and communication? So like difficult to look for positives in the setting of a global pandemic, but I think there are some there, and I think it's an exciting time but a challenging time.
Yeah, I think just to circle back around on a few of those points, that agree with it's sped up some things. So we've worked with a couple of retailers, and they've 6 years in the planning of doing, let's say, online delivery, and they've managed to do it in 3 weeks, 2 weeks. So, and we've talked about it on a couple of other podcasts. It's amazing when bureaucracy steps out of the way and the ability to try stuff and fail a little, but to move forward is embraced. So agile development, in effect, in a retail operations world gets you some seismic gains. So I hope that stays. We'll see. And the other stuff around tasks, that's really interesting, because I'm not 100% sure that anybody's really nailed omni-channel. I think people talk about it, but actually it's still multi-channel. But that whole removing non-value add tasks, removing unnecessary process has always been the challenge in retail, I think, but actually becomes more of a challenge now, where the customer expectation, as you kind of said at the start, is they want different experience, or they want it to be more functional. If we're demanding, let's say, from our supermarkets, a broader range of choice, that just magnifies the complexity. So if my local supermarket's got 4 ranges of ketchup, but actually as a consumer we're demanding 12, makes it fourfold more complex to get the stock in, to count the stock, to pick the stock of home delivery, to price the stock, to put it on promotion. So I think as customers we complicate lots of things for retailers and then wonder why they struggle to deliver at times.
I wonder if the consumer sort of expectation and behavior might have changed and might have shifted. I suspect I'm an outlier in the population, but if there's one type of ketchup, I'd be delighted, and so I think maybe that communication with customers to sort of explain the complexity, because I think, we, prior to being in this world, I didn't think about the complexity of stacking shelves and the different product offerings, and the product mix. But I think consumers get it. And if you look at how the population have changed and their expectations have changed and shifted, it's an education for them. But, I think that is right. We will just need, retailers, as they look at profitability, will need to look at, where their profit margins currently are, because they certainly have changed. So in-store cafes won't be generating profit as they were. And so, they're looking to drive profitability is not only looking at, where is your margin now and where's your sort of high margin products and what should and could you be promoting, but also what's that going to be like in the future, and as we probably move into a second lockdown, or certainly sort of, let's say, multiple regional lockdowns that might as well be a national lockdown, how are they going to deliver from an infrastructure perspective? That sort of touches on the staff. So your staff we sort of enjoy speaking to teams at the checkout, and I mean, like, such a hard job in the setting of COVID and having to keep people fed. And if you think back to those, those days when the shelves were bare, the emotional stress of that and having to deal with that. So we sort of come out of that, and the workforce are coping, but we might be going into another wave or spike or something similar. Really hard. I'm sure that retailers have their eye on this.
A lot of the theme in that was around flexibility and things changing for colleagues. So maybe them asking more from their employers about how they're treated, the flexibility of the schedules. And you guys did a white paper around the state of retail in a COVID-19 world. Yep. I think one of the stats in there was around 3 in 5 retail workers would be willing to retrain in another role. So as a delivery driver or whatever it might be. How's that going to impact the kind of work you do in terms of scheduling? Because that must bring, we've talked a lot about complexity, but more complexity to your world potentially.
I thought that stat particularly was interesting, that, if you speak to teams in retail, they're very clearly very aware of what's going on, and also thinking about how might they continue to work for an organization and, I guess, make themselves more valuable and more resilient. And that ability and that sort of desire to retrain is really key. And I think if you sort of take a step back, so that's the employee's view is, I would be happy to retrain in order to continue to work for my employer. From an employer's perspective, that's really positive. And I suspect retailers will also need to look at how they, I guess, upskill and multi-skill staff. So, if we think about supply chains and delivery, pre-COVID, it was all about efficiency, and real-time delivery and, just-in-time delivery. And that works in a pre-COVID world. In a post-COVID world, it needs to be much more about resilience. And so that sort of need to increase the skill base within your organization is really key, because it gives you resilience and flexibility. So I guess how that affects scheduling is if you then look at cohorting. So lots of organizations now cohorting staff, and all that broadly means is dividing staff up into smaller groups. So if someone gets COVID symptoms or is COVID infected, you need to isolate that cohort or that bubble, to use the political term, without affecting the rest of the organization. Now, those cohorts, as I mentioned earlier, there's some schools that have, cohorts of hundreds or thousands. Can't do that in a retail environment. You can't shut a store because, one person's become infected. So the key with cohorts is, how do you design that cohort in a way that, protects your staff? It's one of the key points of cohorting staff. And the second is to minimize business disruption. So in the event that you have to, take that cohort out and isolate them or test them, how do you do that in a way that minimizes the impact on the business? And therefore, the ability for other staff to step into roles that they might not have done is really key. And we'd seen this in organizations, interestingly, pre-COVID. It was on ships, on cruise ships. The ability to have knowledge of different ships was really key, because in the organization, it gave them much more flexibility. And I think there's a parallel here, which is having that resilience in your organization is great. Now, that actually can be an input to and a desired output of scheduling, because what ideally you want to do with the schedule is make sure that you have a schedule that minimizes your risk or maximizes your resilience. I guess just for those who don't think about scheduling a lot, there are a couple of stages of scheduling. One is designing the schedule, which is your work pattern for that week or month or year. So that's the sort of plan of what would happen. And then what actually happens is probably not what you expected to happen. So, people call in sick and, people turn up late and unexpected things happen. What you want to do in that planning stage is make sure that you've got enough resilience and cover. Now, if everybody is streamlined that they can only do that task that they're allocated for, doesn't give you a lot of ability to react intraday and move people between departments, for example. I think that's going to become really key, certainly for bigger retailers, is how do we sort of increase resilience and sort of balance that with the effect of cohorts and and planning for some of those cohorts to need to isolate.
Yeah, and again, we talked about holy grails in retail. It's been flexibility of staff's been one for a while, and this has driven that. And it'd be interesting to see whether people do that across jobs or process. So are we going to get to a world where actually, if I work in a supermarket, I take the online order, I pick the online order, I deliver the online order and bring back any returns, etc., which gives me full accountability of the end-to-end process. So if I pick it wrong, I have to face the customer and face the consequences of that. Or will people keep it in more, job families or job groups? So, I could potentially be general assistant, work on the tills, work on a deli counter, but not necessarily follow the process. I don't know. I think they tend to think about it in a world of job or functional skill. I am trained to do the fish counter or not, rather than end-to-end process. And as ever in retail, variance in process is always big across people and across locations. So it'd be interesting to see if anybody goes down the end-to-end process ownership route. And that means there's less deviation or less faults in the process, which therefore drives less rework and more productivity. So I think that there's an interesting watch out there. And when we launch the pod, we'll signpost people to the white paper so they could download it and have a read as well. We've talked a lot about kind of current state. If we cast our minds forward a little bit to the future, have you got any views on where you see retail or even further afield than the UK retail heading, or what it looks like? I know you've mentioned things around, speed, experience, really taking into account, the way of working in cohorts and upskilling and cross-training. Any other bits you wanted to add to that?
it was a tough time for retail before. It's clearly going to be tough, but more than that, I guess it's going to be uncertain. And we saw casualties on the high street pre-COVID, Maplin and Toys R Us, big, well-loved household high street names that are no longer on the high street. And I'm sure there will be high street casualties. And, and you're seeing in the news almost daily, the sort of the steps that big retailers are taking to make sure that they're, fit for the future and able to survive. I think it's going to be tough, but, in the vast majority of cases, retailers are sort of facing into this challenge and reacting and sort of accelerating change that will probably end up being good for the vast majority of them. But the world is going to change. And I think, stores will change and bricks and mortar stores will become much more experiential. A vast majority of people that we surveyed said they still want to go to bricks and mortar stores. So, despite all of this, there is still that desire for, a human interaction and a retail experience. So I think there's lots of positive, but I think we will see more casualties. I think it'd be unrealistic not to expect that. The fit will survive. The fit ones will survive, and it's that driving the digital transformation, operational transformation, and the sort of organizational resilience. And the retail world will look different, but probably not hugely different on the other side.
Yeah, I think for me, it's back to that. It's sped up. So has COVID caused retail businesses to go out of business? It's probably been the straw that breaks the camel's back, but there was clearly, a bit like COVID, some underlying health conditions before that this unfortunately sped up. I think it's interesting because you use the words kind of much loved. And I think that's sometimes where retailers come unstuck. Maplin, Woolies, Blockbuster, to name a few, people will say we're much loved British Institutes of Retail. We didn't love them that much to keep them going. I think there's a big watch out in terms of you can't just rely on your brand, because there's even bigger ones today than that are muted to be struggling or looking at different ways of cutting retail or cutting people. So the British are good, aren't they, at saying it was a much loved brand. Actually, we don't back that up by going and shopping there, because if we did, they wouldn't be where they are. It's a bit of a interesting dichotomy, really.
No, I think you're right. I think Blockbuster is probably the best example. I took my kids to see the Blockbuster I used to go to as a kid, but you have to explain to them what a video was, and that you had to go down to the video shop and you'd borrow it, but then you'd watch it and then you'd bring it back. It's just a whole new world. And yes, I sort of feel emotional and nostalgic, but in this environment, I'm a big fan of Netflix, so it's never going to survive. So yes, I know what you mean. Nostalgic, but practical.
Yeah, absolutely. And people vote with their feet, don't they? A couple of last questions to finish things off then. In terms of your solution to the RotaGeek stuff, what would you say are kind of some of the unique bits that you offer? It's a very busy market. It's a very difficult market, I think, to navigate, to tell the difference between what different solution providers offer. So have you got any stuff that you think would interest people that are listening if they're on the lookout for a solution?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief so as not to make it an advertising pitch. But but you're right. I think that idea that it's crowded. I often think about this. If I were a retailer looking for a scheduling solution, gosh, that's a hard challenge to start looking at what the differences are between all the providers. The key thing that we do that's different is we data optimize staff schedules, and so what that means is we get an optimal distribution of your staff to meet your customer demand, which is clearly good for the business because they optimize payroll spend. It's clearly good for customers because they get served by the right people with the right skill mix at the right time. For your team and your retail team, we increase flexibility and make scheduling a cooperative process. And there's lots of data to show that's really great, not only for retention, but also for sales, because happy employees sell more. And we've got some really good data to show that. So just very briefly with Gap UK, actually, so this data is public, we were able to show that the stores that had RotaGeek in had higher footfall conversion, higher basket size, and higher customer NPS. So sort of in very brief, it was a really nice real world example of our sort of data mathematical optimization making a really positive impact for the business.
Good stuff. And what's the next big thing that's coming in scheduling? There's been lots of development in kind of what we call task and employee comms piece. So what do you see the next big thing being?
The next big thing in scheduling is hyper personalization. We're seeing this across industries. And if you look in retail, and what we've been talking about is how do you personalize the retail experience to your consumer and your customer? But we need to personalize that for the employee and the workforce, and feel really strongly about this. Just if you just think about it logically and practically, people's need for flexibility and stability varies throughout their lifetime and throughout a year, and can be sort of impacted by all sorts of things, unexpected events in someone's life. The tech's there for us to handle this. And one of the key drivers and the key sort of backbones of this is our ability to create data optimized schedules, because once you're able to do that, then the personalization bits just become an input. We're then able to look at things like, if you think about someone's lifetime working for a retailer, so imagine one of the big retailers where you might spend your entire life working there. Early on in your life, you might want and need much more flexibility. And then later on in your life, you might want and need a bit more stability of your shift pattern. It just becomes an input into auto scheduling our algorithm. I think we can also then look at performance and I guess times that being on shift is much better for them. I work much better at night, just the way I am. And so when I worked in the emergency department, I used to love doing night shift, suited me down to the ground. And you'll see that in people, that, a preference for morning or late shifts. And actually, the ability to personalize schedules to that is absolutely possible. And then you can look at the team level. We know that high functioning teams perform better. And so being able to look at the performance of teams and schedule them appropriately, what is it about that team that makes it high performing? Is it the individuals, or is it the skill mix, or is it the mix of seniority and junior staff? So I think that really detailed personalization, but from almost a hands-off data optimized perspective, I think is really key, because what we do currently is we drive optimization from paper or sort of legacy systems, and that's great. That's the first initial win. But the key for us as an organization is, great, then what do we deliver on top of that? And so I think that's the next big step for us. And I think we'll probably see that across other scheduling platforms too.
Yeah, no, I like that. And clearly then the ability with that data to provide, as you say, that second, third level of insight or correlation or trend, and then do some predictive stuff, I'm sure it makes it exciting for those using, because you're then in a world, as you say, of satisfying your colleagues, your employees, because you've taken into account their preferred working patterns that are dynamic. Like you say, it's not fixed. To move that into how that affects the productivity of them personally or the teams is probably insight that I don't think really exists at the moment in lots of retailers, in probably all to a degree. I think it's a lot more functional at the moment of someone's employed for 30 hours. This is the best way they use their 30 hours, not with the cross analysis of, well, actually, I really am a morning person, so I work much better. My brain's better in the morning, give me the early shifts, through to, like you say, you preferred working at night. I don't think there's the data or the accessibility of data to help people understand what does and doesn't work.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's an important caveat with all of these, is there's an interplay between what is technically possible and what is, reasonable to do with data. And that, that sort of, that sense check of, although it's possible doesn't mean it's a good thing. And when you start looking at sort of productivity of individuals, that you can see how that can be a really positive thing, and that can be used for positive. It can also be used for not good things. So you just need to tread carefully when we start looking at this stuff. But it's a really fascinating area, and what's technically capable is fascinating. And you just need to make sure that you sort of tread, appropriately and sensitively.
Well, it's been great to catch up and chat. Final question from me is, what's the best bit of business advice you've ever been given?
I think probably with that in mind, the best bit of business advice was listen to everyone and ignore most of it.
It's like bringing up kids though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everyone's got the best bit of advice, but you find your own way.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's definitely listen to everyone. There's definitely value in that, but don't be afraid to then, take that, assimilate it, ignore what you think is irrelevant, make your call, and then stand by it and just accept that, you will be wrong, and that's okay.
Cool. And if people want to find out more, Chris, where's the best place for them to get in touch with you or the team?
Our website, rotorgeek.com. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter, so at Chris McCulloch.
Perfect. Listen, it's been amazing to catch up as always. I love chatting with you. Some of your stories are amazing, and I'm sure we'll catch up soon. But in the meantime, thanks for coming on and look after yourself.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me.